Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll kick off here having Aerie. Vince, very appreciative you took the time and came to the conference. And Ami, thank you very much again for coming. I think this is now a few annual trips here, so we're appreciative. So before we get started and jump into Q&A, and it's open to the audience as well, maybe I'll just turn it over to you for some opening thoughts or opening comments.
Sure. Well, obviously, it's a very, very exciting time for the company. We just finished our first year with actual revenues, and so it wasn't just a pure burn year for us. And Repressa's off to a great start, and we're hoping that by Thursday of this week, we actually get approval for Rocklatan, which we think will be a great addition for the physicians and the patients that they treat for glaucoma. The company's progressing very, very well, and we'll see that we filed an 8K today, and as promised, we continue to update quite a bit of the information that we have in there, especially as it relates to prescription activity. As you know, towards the end of last year, IQVIA made some changes on how they report their algorithms and the like, and the impact on us, and so we were not particularly pleased with some of the things that we saw. So we started publishing, and it's on slide 6 of that deck, information in terms that what I look at almost every day, which is actual shipments of our product from wholesale to retail. And it's an actual number. It's not based on an algorithm or anything like that. It's actual reported revenues. And so what we wanted to do is just to show you how that trend was progressing, because I think it'll answer an awful lot of questions that folks have had about how we ended up last year. I think we surprised a lot of folks with finishing up the year at $24 million, which is right smack in the middle of the range, and we exited the year at $14.5 million for the quarter for Repressa, which certainly sets us up very, very well with a run rate, assuming no growth, of about 50 or 55 million. Street consensus is about double that for this calendar year, but that also includes Rocklatan. So I think we exited very well. We've moved the pipeline forward. Also, this year we have our first retina program that's actually treating patients right now in early stage trials. We've got a second retina program coming out in Q2 of this year. And unfortunately, we're doing an awful lot of travel, so I've already been to Japan and headed over to Europe here over the next week or so as we expand our reach outside the United States. So overall, it's a great year for us, and we're ecstatic about this calendar year, especially given that we have Rocklatan approval hopefully coming on Thursday. I am headed to the American Glaucoma Society meeting, which is actually being held this week. So, we paid a lot of money to make sure that timing lined up.
Good, fantastic. That'll be good advertising. So maybe we'll step back and talk about Repressa in the sense of any learnings during the launch, any changes to the sales force or messaging. Can you take us from time of launch, things that surprised you, maybe you saw that was working in some areas, not working in others, and bring us up to where we kind of stand today?
So two bits of surprises. One of them was physician-related or market-related, and the other ones were on sales force. From a physician point of view, the thing that amazed us the most, and as some of you know, we had another pharmaceutical company in ophthalmology prior to coming to Aerie, and we sold that back in 2012. And so the delta from 2012 to today in terms of the physicians, the impact on physicians of managed care has been very dramatic. Not just from the fact that they're controlling a lot of what they do, but just simply the physician's outlook. They're tired, and it just seems like every time they turn around, there's new rules and regulations being put on them, and new controls, and they can and can't do things. And so it's been a dramatic shift over a very short period of time to see that. So that certainly played out as we were trying to get them behind us to help getting our product Repressa on formulary. So that was number one. Number two, from a sales force point of view, one of the things that we noticed is we were looking for a lot of folks, and a good mix of folks, but a lot of folks that had ophthalmology experience. And what we found is a lot of them, we had 5,000 applicants for 100 jobs, and so that was an amazing pool of talent to choose from. And what we found, though, was that there was a large group of those sales reps that actually had never launched an ophthalmic pharmaceutical before. They had been at large companies. They hadn't seen any new product launches. They didn't know what to go through in terms of trying to get the physicians to help them get on with prior authorizations and things like that. And so as a result, some of them weren't performing. So we actually moved out 14% of our sales force. And we did that within the first 6 months because our mantra was, if the person isn't cutting it now, what are the chances they're going to be able to help us when Rocklatan comes out? And we didn't want to go through training for Rocklatan, which we started towards the end of last year, with folks that we didn't think would be with us at the beginning of the year. So we made those kinds of moves. So we now have a full complement of 100 people out in the field. We'll always have one or two territories that are open, but we think we have a pretty good handle on the profile and very talented people in-house.
Okay, any evolution at this point where the clinicians started using Rhopressa and kind of where we stand today? Are we seeing it migrate a little bit earlier? Kind of any thoughts on how that might be changing, how the treatment paradigm might be changing with Rhopressa?
Okay, as you know, it's not unusual for a physician when they first see a medication, especially a class of drugs that they've never had their hands on before, to say, I'm just going to add it to my worst patients. And so we call that max medical therapy. And some of these patients that they were trying it on were on 3 or 4 meds, and all of a sudden they were headed for surgery. And then they said, oh, look, I've got one new medication called Rhopressa. Let me try that for a month or so and see what happens to your pressure. And so it's the worst case scenario from a trial point of view. But yet we had more than enough docs who had great experiences. And so they were getting incremental 3 to 5 millimeter drops in pressures after being on 4 different medications. They kept them on those medications. But by doing that, they avoided surgery. Now, not everybody did. Now, some of them, didn't get much, but, enough of those where they moved through pretty good. And so, like today, we have something like 200 doctors that have written over 500 prescriptions, and now they're moving that towards just purely adjunctive therapy to a prostaglandin. Their very first add-on is Rhopressa, and if a prostaglandin doesn't work or is not indicated for that particular patient, they'll start them off with Rhopressa along with a beta blocker or carbonic anhydrase inhibitor or something like that. We have 700 docs who have written over 200 prescriptions, so again, they're somewhere along that continuum, all the way down to right now we have about 6,000 out of 14,000 doctors that are on our call audience that have not written a prescription yet. Okay. And so with some information that's going to be coming out as part of the Rocklatan clinical series about Rhopressa, they'll be able to get some additional information about Rhopressa and obviously Rocklatan, and we're hoping to start converting some of those. So we're seeing the shift, and certainly as they write more and more scripts, we're moving towards what we thought would be the ultimate positioning of is Rhopressa being the first adjunct to a prostaglandin.
Okay, and any feedback on red eye and discontinuations, anything different than what you would have thought going into it, or any feedback you have now as you've been deeper into the launch?
In terms of discontinuation rates or anything like that, what we're seeing is not unusual regardless of the practice setting for the physicians. We see roughly about 10-15% discontinuation rate when they start with a sample, right? Because before they give them a script, they give them a sample. If the sample doesn't work or they get the red eyes, they're only getting a millimeter or 2 drop in pressure, nowhere near where their target was, then the red eye becomes more bothersome. If they're getting a 5+ millimeter drop in pressure, and then all of a sudden the red eye doesn't seem to be as bothersome anymore, and so they're willing to sort of live through it. Okay.
And you look very peaceful and happy, and Rocklatan's coming up, and you're willing to even laugh at that, so that's a good sign too. Maybe any thoughts as we're getting this close to the approval?
No, the whole process of getting Rocklatan approved was relatively straightforward. It's a major milestone for our industry in the sense that we've never had a once-a-day combination approved for glaucoma. All the other products that have been approved are 2 to 3 times a day, and there's only 3 combinations out there, so it's not a big deal yet. So we think this will be, and it's also the first one where we've had not only a Rho kinase inhibitor, which is a new class, but also it'll be the first combination that contains a prostaglandin. And so we think it certainly will set the bar pretty high for future combinations. So we feel very, very comfortable. We follow the rules. I've always said that as long as we listen to what the FDA says, particularly Wiley Chambers, who runs our side of the FDA, we just simply listen to what he says for us to do, and we do it, we can typically get an approval. And so that's exactly what we did. So obviously, always keep our fingers crossed. We did light a few prayer candles, but we're looking forward to Thursday.
Good, okay. And then from a Rhopressa kind of coverage perspective, both commercial and Medicare, and now as we look forward to Rocklatan, 1, again, any learnings or changes you would do differently, and then 2, what should we expect about the uptake in terms of commercial?
I was pleasantly surprised by our coverage with Repressa. We're always frustrated, but I was pleasantly surprised in the sense that 2 months after approval, we were on 12% of the Medicare plans, 85% of the commercial plans had us covered. By 6 months after approval, we were up to about 40+% Medicare Part D coverage and about 90% commercial coverage. And towards the end of this quarter, beginning of next, we'll be about 70-75% Medicare Part D and then about 95% commercial coverage. And so when I compare that to other products that are in the category, that's about as good as it's gotten. And if I compare us to other products that have been launched recently in glaucoma, or not just in glaucoma, but just generally in ophthalmology, it's a pretty darn good track record. So I'm pleased about that. The one thing learning is that we ended up making a decision to move everything towards Tier 2. What we found in a lot of the research that we did, especially with patients, is once a copay gets up over $50, they don't pick up the script. And so why do you want to go through all the hassles of doing all this stuff and not have the prescription picked up, right? Because if the doctor gets enough of those patients to not pick up the script he just wrote, he's just going to quit writing. And so that's why we decided to move to Tier 2, and that's why we've been guiding street numbers to about $100 a script for Repressa. We think Rocklatan, we're going to do the same thing, try to get to Tier 2 as quickly as we possibly can, and that'll be about $115 net for us. And so, but that was the whole rationale for that.
And should Rocklatan kind of go the same trajectory you just laid out for how Repressa went? Is there any way that it can be sped up or make it a little easier?
What we've guided towards is the same cadence of both commercial and Medicare Part D coverage as we saw with Repressa. Again, 10-12% roughly about a couple of months after approval. Then about 5-6 months later, getting up into the 40s, and then eventually 9 months to a year later up to the 75+%. I can give you all sorts of reasons as to why managed care should put this on faster. I just don't think that it's worthwhile having that argument yet. And so I think we're going to try it. There is no other drug ever in the history of treating glaucoma that's gotten this many patients down to such low pressures as Rocklatan did in its own clinical trials. And so I think there's a lot of good reasons why there's going to be a clamoring to this by the physicians and the patients. And managed care, I think, will follow. So I think there's a very good chance it'll come sooner. But we'll let you know if it does.
Okay. So let's talk about introducing Rocklatan. Obviously, we're Repressa on the market. Maybe sense of the sampling and how the street should think about these next couple quarters as you try to introduce a new product and kind of manage Repressa still at the same time.
Well, we've always talked about the fact that we were agnostic as to whether a physician wrote for Repressa or Rocklatan as long as every one of his patients got one or the other. And so we priced everything the same way. We're trying to convince managed care to do that. And certainly from a sales force incentive point of view, they're not going to have any incentive at all to go one way or another. Every doctor, as soon as we get Rocklatan approved, is going to get a Rocklatan detail. So we're going to immediately talk about Rocklatan and make sure that they understand what it does and what the clinical trials look like, what the responder analysis has been, et cetera, et cetera. Then in the same slide, in the same presentation, we're going to transition over to Repressa, because as we said right from the very beginning, in the Mercury series, which were the studies for Rocklatan, Repressa actually performed better in those clinical trials, i.e. got a bigger intraocular pressure drop than it did in its own trials, because everything was once a day. We weren't handicapped by comparing it to a twice-a-day drug. And so the rep is going to walk in, he's going to do the Rocklatan thing, he's going to talk about Repressa, and immediately get into the discussion about how are you planning on using it in your practice? What kind of patients do you see, et cetera. And so we think that the tilt there is going to purely be reimbursement. The minute that reimbursement comes out of the doctor's mouth, we're going to be able to show them, all right, here are the plans that you're on, here's where we have Repressa approved, which will be in the majority of them, and then here's where we are with Rocklatan. Some doctors are going to immediately jump to Rocklatan no matter what. If you're, in Chevy Chase, Maryland, or if you're where I live in Naples, Florida, or if you're down in the Upper East Side of New York, many of your patients may not care about what the copay is. And so you're going to jump to Rocklatan, and if you tell them to use Rocklatan, they'll pay the $100 copay or whatever it takes. But others won't. And so we think that's going to tilt the presentations and the use of samples, et cetera, once the doc commits saying, well, gee, I think I want to use Rhopressa until you get Rocklatan on, or no, I'm going to use Rocklatan for every one of my patients right out of the gate. And I think, so there'll be a mixed bag. I think that's going to be the key driver there.
So you think there's some patients that actually won't step through just a generic prostaglandin and could go right to Rocklatan?
Oh, I do. I think that's going to be the biggest chunk there. Because why would you not, if you were thinking about using a Rhopressa anyway and your patient's already on latanoprost generic, the way we're pricing this thing, i.e. the delta between Rhopressa and Rocklatan, is really the cost of a generic script. So why wouldn't you immediately just jump to Rocklatan instead of doing an add-on to Rhopressa? I think that, so for that perspective, I think you're right. I think there's still about 15-20% of the market that physicians that are using Lumigan or Travatan. Those guys don't necessarily want to switch back to latanoprost or switch to latanoprost, so their Rhopressa is going to be probably their adjunctive drug of choice. And there's still about 10 or 15% of the patients where they're not, where prostaglandins either don't work or they don't want the adverse events, the permanent cosmetic changes that they occur. So they just will go right to Rhopressa. So that's why we always have said we think of the delta between the two, Rocklatan and Rhopressa, is 3x towards Rocklatan being 3x bigger than Rhopressa. But we always have thought and still believe that Rhopressa will have a pretty good sized market share.
Okay. You commented and made a comment about the street consensus on the quarter. I'm assuming you're feeling very back-end loaded, or we should be thinking as managed care picks up, give you some breathing room here, and around Q4 we start to really see a nice acceleration.
Yeah, I think so, and you'll be able to see it. So if I take you back to Q4 for Rhopressa, so we jumped from 12% Medicare Part D coverage to 40% Medicare Part D coverage October 1. If you look at the scripts in November 1st, they had jumped 22% and 23%. And so I think that that's about what we're ready to see here. You'll see those gates coming through for Rocklatan as well. And we'll tell you when we sign those things, and so you'll be able to see it. I think, the ebbs and flows of the quarters are going to be driven by a lot of different things. This first quarter is always kind of screwy because you got, folks trying to buy in right at the end of the year, to get through the winter, Christmas to New Year's kind of a period. We have the fact that the deductibles kick in January, so all of a sudden you see attrition there. February is a stub month, so now March is our first full month. And the good news is, it's like just today, the data that I was telling you about, the shipments of wholesalers to retail, just today we had our second largest day ever. So that was yesterday's number. So we feel pretty good about the uptake here. You'll see these ebbs and flows, and then, unfortunately for us, wholesalers, we've been telling them about Rocklatan coming, so they're sitting there saying, well, geez, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't buy as much Rhopressa, in light of maybe Rocklatan coming in. So I think we'll see some bouncing around quarter to quarter, but overall, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Okay, good. And then you mentioned Japan and Europe. Can you just give us an update, some of the catalysts we should be thinking about?
Well, the biggest catalyst in Europe is that we are expecting approval for Rhopressa towards the end of this calendar year. So the MMA is underway and under active review, and so we do expect to get that approval towards the end of the year. And then as soon as we get that approved, then we'll submit for Rocklatan. We're building our commercial presence in Europe as we speak. Our head of Europe starts April 1st, and so it'll be his challenge to start looking at, especially the top 5 countries, what the infrastructure is going to look like. We do not plan on launching Rhopressa in Europe until we have Rocklatan approved and priced. And the reason for that is purely that we get to use our clinical trials here in the U.S. and Europe. And because Rhopressa was done against Timolol, and it's generic, the price for Rhopressa in Europe is going to be pretty low if that's where we go in first. And so we're going to wait till we do Rocklatan. We've got Mercury 3 study underway in Europe, where we're comparing Rocklatan to Ganforth, which is it's a combination of Lumigan and Timolol, and it's one of the highest priced combos that they have in Europe. So It's basically for pricing reasons. And so we'll get Rocklatan approved and then priced, and then we'll launch Rhopressa underneath it.
Okay.
In Japan, a totally different story. Our Rho kinase inhibitor will be the second one on the market. It's the only place in the world where there's a Rho kinase inhibitor already in the market. It's called Granitec. It's been on the market for a couple of years. After 2 years, it's a 4% market share. It's pretty dramatic. The product is twice a day. It doesn't work particularly well. It only drops pressure an incremental millimeter or two. And even with that, it has a 4% market share. When you look at our clinical data in those kinds of patients, and we reported on a probe study that we did on Japanese and Japanese American patients at the beginning of this year, we actually had pressure starting at 17 millimeters of mercury. These are glaucoma patients starting at 17. It's not unusual for the Japanese eyes to be 3 to 5 millimeters lower in pressure than the Caucasian eyes, even though they have a greater incidence of glaucoma. But we took those 17 millimeters down to 11 and 12. That drug doesn't even come close to that, and it's not once a day. And so the physicians the Japanese physicians that have seen the results are thinking that Rhopressa is going to be the biggest drug ever in Japan because of that. It works better, lower pressures. We know that. We've always known that. And what's interesting is the other Rho kinase inhibitor, because it's a totally different chemical structure, doesn't work particularly well at low pressures. It only works at slightly higher pressures, and then not particularly well. So we like our chances over there.
Good.
But we're having to start over. So we're doing our first phase 2 trial in Japan now. We have 25 sites. We were over there about a month or so ago to kick that off, and we expect that we'll have full enrollment by the end of the calendar year.
Okay. Before we pivot to the pipeline, and you have a lot going on just with Rhopressa and Rocklatan here and potentially internationally, but there are some assets up for sale in the ophthalmology space.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah. So any appetite? These are not, some of them, or one of them is not small.
Right.
Any appetite to even think of or contemplate assets like a Xiidra that could be available?
So Xiidra is Takeda announced a long time ago that they were going to get rid of this thing. It's been on the market now for about 9 months in terms of the actual process kicked in at the beginning of the year. It's about $300 million plus in revenues. They're expecting that they're going to generate somewhere around $5 billion or so. For us, we're not even close to being willing to do that. It's not even a value proposition. It's just we're not willing to do that. Especially given that we think that the pricing for Xiidra has got to be impacted by generic Restasis. Whatever managed care coverage they now have is going to be even more difficult for them once you have a generic Restasis option out there. And so I think that's kind of a rough one for us to even think about going after.
Right.
We are interested in 4 different areas in ophthalmology today where, as we strive to become the next major company in ophthalmology we need to be in. We're already in glaucoma, so we're thinking that we want to continue in that area, and so we'll look for other things that we can do there. We're just now starting with retina. We have our own steroid in our insert that will last 6 months. That went into the clinic just this month, and we're excited about the prospects there. And then we have our Rho kinase inhibitor, protein kinase C inhibitor that goes in for wet AMD that goes into the clinic next quarter, I'm sorry. And so we're excited about there. We think we have some other things that we can do in retina, especially given that we now have our own print technology, which allows us to take small molecules, put them in or insert with a polymer, inject them into the back of the eye, and get it to last for anywhere 6 to 12 months, whatever we choose to. The other 2 areas we're interested in, we know that there's 9 companies that are reporting data on dry eye. Some of them have already done it. There's a whole bunch that are coming over the next few months, and so we're interested in there. I don't think most people realize there's 30 million patients that suffer from dry eye in the United States, and only 2 or 3 million of them are actually treated. And so we think that you could have multiple shots on goal, different mechanisms that will only work on certain patients. Certainly that's what we're seeing with Restasis and Xiidra. I think we have a shot at going after some of those assets, and so those things we're interested in. The other area that's kind of interesting, which is a non-reimbursed market, is on the refractive side. See, a lot of you are wearing reading glasses, And so we have a series of companies out there today that are looking at repurposing a couple of drugs in combination to actually allow your lens to adapt so that with an eye drop, you won't need those reading glasses for the next 2 or 3 hours. And so using, again, our print technology, we found a class of molecular structures that we can put in our insert. We can inject it into the back of the eye. It'll last about anywhere from 6 months to a year, and actually do the same thing as these eye drops do, and they only work literally for a couple hours, where ours would last for about a year. And so we are interested in some of these areas, and so we think we can build a pipeline. The challenge is build the pipeline before I have to report profits.
Okay. We'll let you pinch hit here for Rich and just ask about cash and maybe burn, and I'm sure he's listening, so you better not screw up.
No. We're in pretty good shape, and we provided guidance for this year, and this is a reminder, we have roughly about $300 million in the bank in terms of cash and a credit facility that's available, that's currently untapped. And so what we provided guidance for was total expenses, gross, of about $215 million. That's sort of the midpoint of the range that we provided. And so that's not different in terms of the actual number as we had last year. It's just the makeup of the 215 is very different. No capital expenditures like we had last year for our plant in Ireland, but we're building inventories over there because that'll come online towards the end of the calendar year, et cetera. So we have quite a bit of money, $215 million expenses. And then, again, we tend to be able to collect about 80 to 90% of everything we sell within the calendar year. And so, if we hit consensus, which is about $114 million, we'll collect about 80, 90% of that. And so our net burn is going to be a lot less than our total cash balances. So I think we're in pretty good shape. We've always said that for operating reasons, we don't need to go raise money. If we decide to do an acquisition, then that's a different story.
Okay, great. Any questions before we wrap it up? I'm not sure I heard the question. As patient behavior? Is it ophthalmology specific?
It's not ophthalmology specific. So the question is related back to my comment about the market research done on patients, and that was more of a general one. And so what it said was about 30. If you keep the copays under $40 or $50, roughly 75%, again, this is an aggregate, about 70-75% of the prescriptions actually get picked up, where the patient says, yep, I'm willing to pay that kind of copay. If you go up a little bit, if you clear 50 to go up to the next level, i.e. more tier 3 kind of copays, you're looking at the drop-off going from 70-75 to only 30% of the prescriptions get picked up. And if you go to the last tier, only 20% of those prescriptions get picked up. And so in terms of utilization and the like, in terms of focus for the sales force, we just said if we're going to spend this kind of money having those folks out there generating these scripts, we sure as heck want to make sure that they get picked up. So that's why we made a decision to go to tier 2. Yes, sir.
My understanding is the Irish print doesn't cost for 2020, is that correct?
So the question is related to our Irish facility coming on stream until 2020. We actually just completed our 3 validation batches last week, right before our national sales meeting. So that was a big accomplishment for that group. They're earlier than we expected, and so they're going to be ready for FDA inspection if it comes as early as late Q3. And so we could ship some of that product yet this calendar year if they get an early approval. There's a quirk in the law that because of the Irish authorities, and they're viewed, especially in terms of sterile products, they're among the best in the world. There is a possibility that the U.S. will waive the right to inspect in favor of whatever the Irish authorities claim. And so if we can get approval there, then I think we'll be in good shape. So it could impact us this year.
So there's no concern about not having enough capacity to meet stuff?
We don't have any capacity issues at all. One of the things that I told my head of manufacturing, Ken Rudderman, that there was only one of us who was going to be making a presentation to the board that we could sell, that we could have sold more had we had enough inventories. And so, because I said there's no excuse for ever running out. I'll never talk to them about inventory turns and things like that. And so we have more than enough supply all the way from our starting material to raw material to finished products, and we'll do the same for Repressa as we plan on doing for Rocklatan. So we have plenty of capacity. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for sharing. So you mentioned about the steroid insert for 6 months. How does it differ from the Roche product?
How's it different than the Roche product? Your 6-month to 12-month insert, steroid insert?
Many of the current products are using other mechanical means in order to deliver the drug, and so ours, we can actually jury rig it to whatever concentrations we want and whatever length of time we want. And so it's we won't know what the real differences are until we get them all into the clinic and get the results.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.